The Mysterious Beginning. March, 1977. It was shaping up to be an unremarkable spring morning in the quiet town of Blackwood, nestled in the shadow of the Colorado Rockies. At approximately 6:45 a.m., a faint mist lingered in the air as Richard Carter, a retired schoolteacher with a penchant for early morning hikes, set out for his usual walk along the trails of Hollow Creek Forest. The sun peeked over the ridges, casting long shadows that danced across the forest floor. There was a kind of tranquility that seemed untouched by the chaos of the world, the kind of peace that made Blackwood the perfect town to grow old in, or for some, to bury secrets within. As Richard walked, his boots crunching the brittle remnants of last year's leaves, he felt a strange unease settling in. It wasn't unusual for the forest to go quiet, but that morning the stillness felt suffocating. Even the chirping of birds, a familiar background symphony, was conspicuously absent. Something about the air didn't seem right. Turning the corner near an old, dilapidated wooden bridge that had been out of use for decades, Richard abruptly stopped, his gaze fixed on an unnatural shape lying near a cluster of cedar trees just off the main path. A sick feeling rose in his stomach. At first he thought it might have been a deer hit by a hunter's stray arrow, but as he approached, the truth was undeniable. A human form, a woman, lay crumpled on the forest floor. His breath hitched as he moved cautiously closer. The body, unnaturally posed as if discarded without care, was terribly still. She was partially hidden by a pile of leaves, her clothing torn and muddied, hair fanned out across the damp ground. Something glinted in the faint sunlight, a small object in her hand. Richard would later recall that moment as one of pure dread, as if the entire universe had decided to hold its breath. Shaking, he clutched his scarf tighter, the chill now piercing more than just his skin. He didn't dare touch anything. Instead he hurriedly adjusted his glasses to take a better look, scanning the scene for any sign of movement. There was none. The retired teacher practically sprinted back down the trail, the vision of the lifeless figure burned into his memory. By the time he reached the nearest payphone and dialed 911, his voice was cracking with panic as he reported what he'd found. Within minutes, local authorities descended upon the scene, establishing a perimeter and initiating an investigation that would captivate and horrify Blackwood, and eventually, the nation. The victim's identity was at first a complete mystery, without identification and with little more than the tattered remnants of her clothes, and a cryptic note half tucked into her jacket pocket. The detectives found themselves adrift in questions. Who was she? How did she end up here? And most terrifying of all, was the killer still lurking nearby? The strange corpse and unusual signs. By the time the coroner and detectives arrived at the scene in Hollow Creek Forest, the once pristine serenity of the location had been replaced with an unsettling tension. The crime scene, roped off with bright yellow police tape, felt suffocating under the watchful eyes of oak and cedar trees. The scent of damp earth and something far more sinister hung heavy in the air. Sheriff Thomas Greaves, a middle-aged man with a weathered face that hinted at decades of chasing down trouble in quiet places, crouched by the body. His gray-blue eyes scanned the crumpled form as he carefully adjusted his hat. "It's a young woman," he muttered to no one in particular, though the deputies standing nearby leaned in, almost reverent. A few newcomers on the force had to turn away, hands over their mouths. Her clothes told a grim story. They were torn in odd places, as if hastily ripped during a violent encounter. Her white blouse had once been crisp and clean but was now stained with dirt and streaks of dried blood. She wore a pair of frayed jeans, the fabric ripped at the knees, and mismatched socks peeked out of scuffed tennis shoes. Her long blonde hair, damp from the morning dew, was tangled with leaves and small twigs, fanned out like a halo, a haunting juxtaposition to the gruesome scene. Dr. Abigail Mills, the county's coroner, arrived carrying her black bag and a clipboard. She was a no-nonsense professional whose calm demeanor served her well in moments like this. "Sheriff, give me a moment," she said, kneeling carefully, her gloved hands moving with precision as she began a preliminary examination. "What are we looking at, Doc?" Greaves asked, the urgency in his voice barely masked. "Well, she's in her mid to late 20s, Caucasian, about 5'5" or so," Dr. Mills began, her tone clinical yet tinged with an undercurrent of sorrow. "It's clear there was a struggle. Look at her wrists. Those bruises are consistent with being restrained, likely with rope or some other binding material. We may have some fibers left behind." Sheriff Greaves examined the faint violet-colored bruises encircling her wrists. "And the cause of death?" Dr. Mills frowned, her hand lingering near the victim's neck. Strangulation. You can see the petechial hemorrhaging in her eyes and the ligature marks here, she explained, gesturing closely to the thin bruises that wrapped around the woman's neck like sinister fingerprints. Then, a peculiar detail caught her eye. On the inside of the victim's left forearm was a sequence of numbers, 7 digits, written in fading red ink, like the sort of marker you'd find in an office supply store. "Sheriff, take a look at this." "What in tarnation is that supposed to mean?" Greaves muttered, leaning closer. "A phone number maybe, or something else?" "Could be a clue, could be a red herring," Dr. Mills replied, standing up to stretch her back. "But whoever she was, I'd bet my paycheck the killer left it there for a reason." Nearby, Deputy Caleb Grant froze. He had been searching the immediate area for evidence when he stumbled upon an object partially buried beneath a pile of damp leaves. "Sheriff, you might want to see this." Greaves hurried over, his boots crunching against the debris, and squatted next to Caleb. The deputy lifted the object just enough for the sheriff to see, a single old leather shoe. It was worn down, its sole partially detached, but it didn't belong to their victim. The size was too large and masculine. "What the hell is this doing here?" he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Caleb shrugged, carefully placing the shoe in an evidence bag. As the morning gave way to the early afternoon, more unsettling details began to surface. Across the victim's torn blouse there were faint scratches, as though someone had frantically clawed at her during her final moments. In the pocket of her jean jacket, detectives pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It was damp and smelled faintly of mildew, but the ink had not entirely faded. 2 words were scrawled hastily on it, in what appeared to be blocky, jagged handwriting. "Help me." "That's not exactly comforting," Deputy Aaron Torres murmured, her gloved fingers holding the paper at arm's length. "No kidding," Sheriff Greaves replied. "The question is, was it written by her or by someone else?" The crime scene unearthed as many mysteries as it did horrors. Bits and pieces of evidence seemed to hint at a horrifying struggle. A broken branch smeared with what looked like dried blood, depressions in the dirt as though the victim had been dragged, and faint footprints leading eastward toward the forest's edge. Yet nothing seemed to tell a complete story. Even the forest itself seemed muted, as if mourning. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, and still no birdsong. For the people of Blackwood, the discovery of the body raised a haunting question. Was the killer hiding among them? And if so, how much danger were they all in? By the end of that grim day, it was clear to Sheriff Greaves and his team that this was unlike anything their sleepy town had faced before. As the investigators packed up the evidence and drove back into town, one thought lingered in everyone's mind. The Hollow Creek forest wasn't so quiet anymore. Eyewitness testimonies. The discovery of a body in Hollow Creek Forest sent shockwaves through the small, tight-knit community of Blackwood. News traveled fast in a place where everyone knew everyone, and soon, unease began to settle like a heavy fog over the town. Sheriff Thomas Greaves knew there was no time to waste. The investigation hinged on uncovering as many clues and details as possible, and the townsfolk might hold the key to unraveling the mystery. By mid-morning, deputies had already gone door to door in the neighborhoods closest to the forest. Their goal was straightforward: gather every scrap of information, no matter how insignificant it seemed. Maybe someone had seen an unfamiliar car parked near the forest trails, or remembered hearing strange sounds during the night. Richard Carter, the retiree who'd stumbled upon the body, was the first to be questioned. Still visibly shaken, he sat on a folding chair in the sheriff's office conference room, fidgeting with the corner of his jacket. "Mr. Carter, take your time," said Deputy Aaron Torres softly. She was seated across from him with a notebook, pen poised. Sheriff Greaves stood nearby, arms crossed, silently observing. Carter nodded, exhaling slowly. I've been walking that trail for years," he began, his voice gravelly. "In all that time I've never seen anything so wrong." "You know what I mean?" Torres nodded encouragingly. "Of course. Start from the beginning of your morning. Anything that stood out?" "Well," Carter hesitated. "The forest felt quieter than usual. I know that sounds funny, but the birds, the rustling leaves, it was like the whole place was holding its breath. I didn't think too much of it at first, kept walking just like I always do, but when I turned by that old bridge He stopped, his hands trembling slightly. "That's when I saw her." "What did you notice right away?" Torres asked. "It wasn't normal, the way she was laying there," Carter muttered, shaking his head. "Like she'd been discarded, you know, like trash. Her face was turned away, thank God. I don't think I could have handled seeing that." Torres exchanged a glance with Sheriff Greaves. "Did you see anything else near the scene? Anyone walking? Any cars nearby?" Carter shook his head. No, it was just me and her. I ran out of there as fast as I could. He paused as though suddenly remembering. Wait, there was something. Greaves stepped forward. What is it? There was a man, Carter said, his eyebrows furrowing. I don't know if it was anything, but a couple days ago I passed a guy on the trail, looked out of place, dirty jeans, a flannel shirt, kind of rough looking. He didn't say hello, just kept walking the other way, didn't think anything of it at the time. What direction was he headed? Greaves pressed. Toward the eastern edge of the forest, Carter answered, by the quarry. The detail, however vague, was duly noted. Carter was excused, and soon the deputies turned their attention to canvassing other potential witnesses. Over the next few hours, a mix of useful and perplexing testimonies trickled in. At the Huckabee Diner, the unofficial hub of Blackwood, the waitstaff recalled seeing a stranger sitting alone at the corner booth late the previous evening. He wasn't from around here, said Betty Moore, the owner. We don't get a lot of new faces, so he stood out, scruffy beard, wearing this old baseball cap. He ordered coffee and sat there for an hour, just staring out the window. Did he talk to anyone? Asked Deputy Caleb Grant. Not really, Betty replied, wiping her hands on her apron. He left behind a $20 bill on the table, which was odd because his coffee only cost $1.50. A gas station attendant down the road provided another piece of the puzzling timeline. Saw a guy filling up a couple gas cans around midnight, he said. Didn't say a word to me, just threw a wad of bills on the counter. What'd he look like? Greaves asked. Youngish, maybe early 30s, thin. There was a pickup truck parked outside, kind of beat up grayish color. Didn't catch the plate number. The attendant scratched his head. You don't think he had anything to do with, the body, do you? That's what we're here to figure out, Greaves replied. As the testimonies piled up, one thing became clear. Blackwood was no longer the idyllic small town where folks kept their doors unlocked and left their keys in the ignition. Now, everyone was eyeing each other with unease, wondering if the killer could be sitting just a few bar stools away. By evening, the sheriff's office had compiled a list of potential persons of interest. Some names were based on direct observation, while others came from whispers and rumors spreading rapidly through the town. What do you think, Tom? Deputy Torres asked Sheriff Greaves as they reviewed the statements. I think we're dealing with someone who knows this place, Greaves said, his voice heavy. Someone who's been watching and waiting. A guy like that, he doesn't just show up out of nowhere. He's been here, blending in, maybe for months. And now? Torres asked. Greaves leaned forward, tapping the photograph of the victim on the board. Now he's gotten sloppy, and his time is about to run out. Following the clues. The crumpled note, the 7 faded digits inked on the victim's arm, and a weathered shoe carelessly left behind. These fragments of evidence were the breadcrumbs that Sheriff Greaves and his team hoped would lead them to the truth. But the deeper they delved, the more the clues seemed to twist and tangle, pulling them in conflicting directions. The first lead centered on the string of numbers found scrawled on the victim's arm. Could be a phone number, Deputy Aaron Torres said, sitting in the sheriff's cramped office where maps, photos, and reports cluttered every surface. But in this day and age without an area code, beats me how we trace it. Sheriff Greaves leaned forward, his elbows resting heavily on the desk. Let's cross-check. Look through phone records in the nearest exchanges. Someone in this town might have had a connection to her. Deputy Caleb Grant chimed in, pulling out the county phone registry. We might also get lucky with local businesses. Maybe the number links to a company. Gas stations, motels, even bars around Blackwood. People leave their mark in all kinds of ways. For hours, Torres and Grant worked the phone lines, calling any number remotely resembling the digits. Surprisingly, after dozens of dead ends, they hit on something. Sheriff, Torres called out, holding the receiver against her shoulder with growing excitement. The number matches an old landline registered to a mechanic's garage just outside of town. Owner's name is John Turner. Greaves perked up. Turner? That the guy with the shop up near Ridgeway Avenue? That's him, Grant confirmed. Divorced 3 years ago. Works late, keeps to himself. Nobody I've ever heard causing trouble, but... He shrugged, allowing the suggestion of doubt to finish his sentence. The sheriff snapped his fingers. Let's pay him a visit. John Turner's garage was a relic of another era, an old clapboard structure with faded paint and a warped sign that read, Turner's Auto and Welding. It sat about 6 miles north of Hollow Creek, surrounded by piles of rusting car parts and an oversized dumpster. A sickly-looking stray cat sniffed around the edges of the property. Greaves and Torres arrived mid-morning, parking their police cruiser just outside the chain-link fence. Turner was hunched over a workbench when they stepped into the suffocating space that reeked of motor oil and stale coffee. "Good morning," Greaves began, his voice steady but authoritative. Turner didn't bother looking up. "Morning, what can I do for you? If this is about my parking violations again, I already paid those fines." The sheriff registered the hint of irritation but ignored it. "Not here about parking today. Mind if we ask you a few questions?" Turner sighed and wiped his hands on a filthy rag, turning around. His face was weathered like an old road map, etched with years of sun and grease. "Guess I don't have much of a choice. What's all this about?" Greaves reached into his pocket, pulling out a notepad. "We're investigating a murder. You hear about the body they found in Hollow Creek Forest earlier this week?" "I heard," Turner said flatly. "Not much goes on around here without someone blabbing about it. Shame, whoever she was." Greaves nodded slowly, watching Turner's reaction carefully. "We found something on her. A string of numbers, 7 digits. Turns out it's your landline." For the first time, Turner visibly tensed. His shoulders stiffened, and his eyes darted to the side almost imperceptibly. "My number? Must be some mistake. I don't know anybody who'd— Well, I sure as hell don't know anyone who got themselves killed." Torres stepped forward, her voice softer but no less probing. "Have you had anyone call here recently? Someone you don't recognize? Maybe someone came by asking for directions or help?" Turner twisted the rag in his hands more tightly. "Can't say that I have. Place has been pretty quiet. My regulars come in, get their oil changed, nothing unusual." He paused and added defensively. "Listen, lots of folks knew that number. Been plastered on ads in the paper for years. I don't control who writes it down." "Fair," Greaves conceded. "Still, we'll need a list of visitors or employees who've been around in the past couple months. Anything suspicious? People asking odd questions? Deliveries you weren't expecting?" Turner threw up his hands. "I'm just a grease monkey, Sheriff. I don't know who scribbled my number or why it ended up on some poor soul's arm. If you want to waste your time digging through my appointment book, be my guest." Greaves pinned him with a long, silent stare. Turner held his ground, though a bead of sweat was now glistening on his temple. "That's all for now," the sheriff said finally, motioning Torres toward the door. "But don't plan on leaving town." As Turner's garage faded in their rearview mirror, Torres spoke first. "You think he's lying?" "About something," Greaves muttered. "Maybe it's small, maybe it's big. Either way, we'll be back." Back at headquarters, another piece of the puzzle came into focus. A deputy who'd combed through the victim's pockets had stumbled upon a receipt from a hardware store 2 towns over. The timestamp showed it was printed just days before her murder. "Anybody recognize what she bought?" Greaves asked, holding up the crisp paper beneath the harsh fluorescent light. "Yeah," Caleb chimed in. "Looks like a gas can, duct tape, and a cheap flashlight." Torres raised an eyebrow. "Practical items. Could be she was passing through, or gearing up for something." Greaves exhaled sharply. "Call the store. I want a name, a card, anything that might tell us why she was there." He glanced at the photos pinned to the board. The victim's face still a mystery, the shoe, the numbers. Every clue felt like a single, elusive thread in an unraveling tapestry. "I have a bad feeling about this," Greaves muttered. For now the truth remained just out of reach, taunting them from the shadows of Hollow Creek. One thing, however, was becoming increasingly clear. Every answer they found seemed to only lead to more unanswered questions. A crucial discovery. Days after the body was found in Hollow Creek Forest, the investigation had reached a critical point. Frustration was setting in as the list of suspects grew, and the team was chasing threads that unraveled as quickly as they formed. Sheriff Thomas Greaves knew that the answer, whatever it was right in front of them. They just had to see it. It was Torres who finally broke the stalemate. She had been going through the victim's belongings for the 100th time, meticulously cataloging each piece of evidence when she stumbled upon something nearly overlooked, a matchbook from a bar in the south end of town that locals called the Rusty Nail. "Sheriff?" Torres began, holding the worn matchbook between gloved fingers. "This might be something." Greaves walked over, tilting his head as he examined it. The logo was faded, but it had the unmistakable name of the bar printed in cheap gold foil. "The Rusty Nail," he mused. "That place hasn't been on anyone's radar for a decade. It's a dive." "Exactly," Torres replied. "It's shady enough for this to mean something. Might be where she was on her last night." "Or who she was last with," Greaves added, straightening up. "All right, Torres, round up Caleb. We're paying them a visit." The Rusty Nail was exactly what Greaves had expected. The kind of place where secrets festered in the smoke-filled air and no one bothered to ask questions, especially not to strangers. The neon sign outside flickered lazily, and the faint sound of country rock spilled out each time the battered front door creaked open. Inside, the dim lighting was made worse by the thick haze of cigarette smoke, and the clinking of cheap glasses competed with low murmurs of conversation. When the sheriff and his deputies stepped inside, conversation stopped for a split second before resuming, quieter this time. "Subtle," Caleb muttered under his breath, eyeing the patrons. "Stay sharp," Greaves replied. He scanned the room, his eyes falling on the bartender, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a gray beard and an expression that said he had seen everything. Torres stepped up first, flashing her badge. "We're investigating a recent murder in the area. Need to ask you a few questions." The bartender leaned against the bar, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Depends on what you're asking. Folks come in here for peace, not for trouble." Greaves stepped in, his presence commanding. "The woman who was found in Hollow Creek. Blonde, mid-20s, she had this matchbook on her." He slid it across the bar. "You ever see her in here?" The bartender studied the matchbook for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He scratched his beard before nodding slightly. "Yeah. Think I saw her a couple nights ago, sat at the far end of the bar, real quiet, didn't look like she belonged here." "Why's that?" Caleb asked, notepad already out. "She didn't come off like a regular, you know. Kept looking over her shoulder, uncomfortable-like, ordered a whiskey, barely touched it. Then some guys from the bike crowd showed up and she tensed right up." Greaves' brow furrowed. "Biker crowd? You're not talking about Marshall's crew, are you?" The bartender gave a wry grin. "The one and only. They rolled in, loud as ever. She got up not long after and left in a hurry. Thought it was strange." "Anybody follow her out?" Torres pressed. The bartender shrugged. "Didn't see. Place was busy that night, but I remember Kevin Marshall himself was here. Usually he's the loudest one in the room, but that night he wasn't his usual charming self. He seemed, I don't know, pissed off about something." Greaves exchanged a look with Torres, his jaw tightening. "You've been helpful," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But if you remember anything else, you call my office." As they stepped out of the bar into the chilly evening, Caleb blew out a breath. "Marshall's crew," he said, as though it were inevitable. "Fits his M.O., Torres replied. "Rough, violent, doesn't know when to stop." Greaves nodded. "It fits, but we're not pinning this on him until we've got more than smoke and hearsay." The deputies returned to the station, now armed with a stronger lead. Soon after, the investigation uncovered another critical piece of information. A witness who had been reluctant to come forward finally agreed to speak. The woman, Claire Hendricks, was a waitress at the Rusty Nail. She appeared uneasy as she sat in the sheriff's office, her hands fidgeting with the edges of her cardigan. "Miss Hendricks," Greaves said, his voice kind but firm, "we believe you have information that could help us piece together what happened." Claire hesitated before nodding. I didn't want to get involved, but I remember her, the blonde woman. She sat in my section Tuesday night." "What can you tell us about her?" Torres asked gently. "She looked scared," Claire said, her voice just above a whisper. "Kept asking if Marshall was usually there, like she was hiding from him. When he came in, she froze. I could see her hands trembling." "Did she say why she was afraid of him?" Greaves asked. "No," she replied, shaking her head. "But they knew each other for sure. He cornered her near the bathrooms. They were arguing. Quiet at first, then he grabbed her arm. I didn't hear what they were saying, but he didn't let go right away." Torres leaned forward. "What happened after?" "She pulled her arm away and left in a rush. He stayed behind, brooding. I thought maybe it was the end of it." The room fell silent for a beat. "But it wasn't," Greaves finally said, his voice heavy. He stood and motioned for Torres and Caleb to follow him into the hall. "Marshall's got bigger problems than his bar tab now," Caleb muttered. "Let's make sure we nail this the right way," Greaves replied, already considering the best strategy. "We've got a shaky circumstantial connection and some hearsay. We need hard evidence before we pull him in." Torres crossed her arms tightly. "If Marshall's involved, we need to move quickly before he realizes we're onto him, otherwise he'll run." Greaves nodded, the weight of the case settling over his sharp features. "Then we don't have time to waste. Tracing the gang." As the investigation delved deeper into the tangled web surrounding the murder in Hollow Creek Forest, a name began to surface again and again: Kevin Marshall. Known around town not for his charm or contributions to the community, but for his role as the self-declared leader of Blackwood's roughest biker gang, Marshall's small crew had been connected to trouble more times than Sheriff Greaves could count. Bar fights, petty thefts, even suspected extortion. Marshall and his group, who called themselves the Iron Talons, practically wore their notoriety as a badge of pride. Sheriff Greaves stood in his office staring at a whiteboard cluttered with pinned photographs, handwritten notes, and hastily drawn lines connecting clues. Among them was an old mugshot of Kevin Marshall. His rugged face stared blankly from beneath a mess of dark hair, eyes sharp and cold, challenging anyone who dared cross him. It wasn't much of a surprise when the Iron Talons became a focus of the investigation. What surprised Greaves was just how intertwined they seemed to be with every thread the team pulled. "We've got a problem on our hands," Greaves murmured to his deputies as he tapped Kevin's photo. "Every scrap of evidence, every whisper we hear, leads right back to Marshall or one of his boys. But you know they're not the types to volunteer the truth at a potluck." Deputy Erin Torres crossed her arms, frustration etched on her face. "Locals won't talk, not with Marshall's crew always breathing down everyone's neck. He's got this town scared stiff." "That ends today," Greaves said firmly. "They want fear? Let them deal with mine." Finding the Iron Talons meant following the rumble of motorcycles and the scent of gas station coffee. Marshall's gang wasn't subtle. They made their presence known wherever they went. Greaves and Torres started at their usual haunts. First, Pine Creek Road, where the gang often gathered near the abandoned train depot. The lot was empty. Next, they headed toward an old scrapyard on the outskirts of town. Another unofficial Iron Talons hangout. The place looked deserted at first glance, piles of rusted car parts and scrap metal casting shadows in the late afternoon sun. But as the sheriff's cruiser crunched over loose gravel, Torres spotted a familiar sight, a row of motorbikes lined up just behind the main office. "There they are," she said, nodding toward them. Marshall and 3 of his crew sat on battered lawn chairs, drinking beer and laughing loudly as smoke from their cigarettes swirled upward. Greaves stepped out of the cruiser with purpose, his boots kicking up dust as he strode toward the group. "Well, if it isn't the law," Marshall drawled, smirking as he leaned back, balancing his chair on its hind legs. His tattooed arms rested casually on his thighs. "To what do we owe the pleasure, Sheriff?" Greaves ignored the bravado, arms crossed tightly over his chest. "I'm here for answers, Kevin, and if you play your cards right, this might stay friendly." Marshall laughed, a low, gravelly sound that was quickly echoed by his crew. "Answers? About what? The potholes in town? Sorry, Sheriff, you've got the wrong fixer." Greaves took a step closer, his voice dropping to a measured, dangerous tone. "You know exactly why I'm here. The girl, Hollow Creek, dead, ring any bells?" The laughter died as Marshall's smirk faded. His eyes narrowed, the light-hearted act replaced by something darker. "Yeah, I heard about it," he said flatly. "Don't know what you think I've got to do with it, though." "Witnesses put you at the Rusty Nail the night she was last seen alive," Torres interjected, her voice sharp and cutting. "And from what we hear, there was some kind of disagreement between you two." Marshall tilted his head, his lips twitching into a half-smile. "Oh, is that what you hear? Let me save you the trouble. Yeah, I knew her. Not well, but I knew her. She was the kind that liked poking into things that didn't concern her, especially where I'm concerned." "And what's that supposed to mean?" Greaves shot back. "It means she was trouble," Marshall said, standing now, his height almost towering over the sheriff. "Trouble that I don't need pinned on me 'cause you're out of leads." Torres stepped forward, matching his intensity. "This isn't just talk, Marshall. We've got evidence. Her fear of you, the fight at the bar, and pretty soon we'll have a hell of a lot more connecting you to her murder." Marshall clapped slowly, mockingly. "Oh, evidence, huh? Cute. But where's your proof, deputy? All you've got is hearsay and bad guesses. I didn't touch her." "Then where were you that night?" Greaves pressed, his glare like steel. Marshall shrugged, that smug grin curling his lips again. "Had a few drinks with my pals, went home. That's all you're getting." "Keep telling yourself that, Kevin," Greaves said. "And while we're at it, how about you and your boys stay close? I'd hate to have to come looking for you." Marshall leaned in dangerously close, his voice a low growl. "Whatever you're fishing for, Sheriff, there's nothing here, so stop wasting my time." As Greaves and Torres drove away, she let out an exasperated sigh. "He's lying. You could see it all over him." "Of course he is," Greaves said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "The question is, what's he lying about? The murder itself or something else connected to it?" A call came over the radio just then. "Sheriff, you better get back to the station." Caleb's voice buzzed through the static. "We've got someone here who says they've got information, and it's about Marshall." "On our way," Greaves replied, turning the cruiser around. Back at the station, Greaves and Torres arrived to find a man pacing nervously in the waiting area. His hands were jammed into his pockets, his head snapping up as soon as they entered. He looked worn, his face pale and thin, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of desperation. "And you are?" Greaves asked, sizing him up. "Mark Cullen," the man said quickly. "Listen, I don't want any trouble, but I can't keep quiet anymore. If I don't talk, I'm gonna lose my damn mind." "Have a seat," Greaves said, gesturing to the room. "What do you have to tell us?" Mark swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as he leaned forward. "It's about Kevin Marshall. I saw him with her that night, the dead girl. He was yelling at her at the Rusty Nail. Real bad. She left, but he followed, Sheriff. He followed her." Greaves leaned in, his voice calm but firm. "And you didn't think to tell us this sooner?" Mark winced. "You don't go against Kevin. Not in this town. But now, with everything going on, I can't stay silent anymore. I think he did it." The room went silent as the weight of Mark's words settled over them. Greaves exchanged a glance with Torres, her gaze mirroring the thought running through his mind. "Looks like the iron talons just landed themselves directly in the middle of this mess," Greaves said quietly, "and it's about time we started pulling it apart." Unexpected testimony. Mark Cullen had never been a brave man. A mechanic by trade, he spent his life tinkering with engines, keeping his head down and avoiding anything that could disturb his already fragile sense of peace. But sitting in the fluorescent-lit interrogation room at the station, face pale and eyes darting nervously around the room, Mark looked like a man on the edge of collapse. Sheriff Greaves leaned against the wall, arms crossed, letting the silence stretch. Division tactics. Let him stew in his own unease. To Greaves' left, Deputy Erin Torres sat at the table, her notepad ready, sharp eyes locked on Mark. Opposite them, Mark sat hunched over, his leg bouncing anxiously under the table. "I don't know why I'm here," Mark began, voice cracking as if already regretting whatever he came in to say. His hands fidgeted at the hem of his worn denim jacket as he avoided eye contact. Greaves stepped forward, his boots heavy on the tile floor, and sat opposite Mark. The movement made the nervous man flinch slightly. "I'm going to stop you right there, Cullen," Greaves said, voice low and steady but laced with authority. "You wouldn't be sitting here if you didn't already know. You've got something to say, so just spit it out before you talk yourself into more trouble." Torres leaned forward slightly, softening the tension. "We know it's hard, Mark, but if you've got information to share, now's the time to get it off your chest. If you hold back, and we find out later—" She let the words hang while her look finished the sentence for her. Mark shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the two of them. "I'm not someone I don't want no trouble. Not with him." "With who exactly?" Torres asked, her pen hovering over her notepad. Mark exhaled deeply, his voice quaking as the words started tumbling out. "It's Kevin. Kevin Marshall. I saw him that night. Him and, well, her, the girl." That caught Greaves' attention in an instant, the sheriff's chair scraping against the floor as he sat up straighter. Torres, calm but quick, pressed him. "You saw them together? You're sure?" Mark nodded, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them in Blackwood's eternal chill. "I was out back of the Rusty Nail that night. They were arguing, real bad. I didn't want to say anything before—" His eyes locked on Greaves in a rare moment of boldness. "You know what Kevin's capable of. A guy like me doesn't go poking his nose in Kevin Marshall's business." Greaves tilted his head, his voice laced with menace. "So you kept quiet, knowing about all this while we've been chasing leads blind for days?" His glare didn't need words to finish the thought. "You let a killer run free." Mark paled further. I didn't know it was gonna end up like this. I swear I thought it'd just be another one of his temper fits. They argue, he gets mad, always happens." "What exactly did you see, Mark?" Torres interjected, neutral but insistent. Mark hesitated, his tongue darting out to wet his dry lips. "Well, like I said, they were fighting outside the bar. I couldn't hear every word, but she kept saying something like, 'You're not gonna scare me.' And then she said something about going to the sheriff, about making him pay for something he'd done." "And Kevin?" Greaves pressed. "What was his reaction?" "Oh, you know Kevin," Mark muttered nervously, gesturing vaguely. "He laughs it off at first, talks all big and smug, but when she turned to walk away, well, he wasn't laughing no more." Unease rippled through the room, but neither officer interrupted. They needed him to get to the point on his own. "That's when he grabbed her arm," Mark continued, his voice dropping into a whisper like he was afraid someone might be listening. "Held her real tight and said something like, 'You think you're untouchable? Watch yourself, sweetheart.' She yanked free and stormed off into the parking lot. I figured, she'd just go home." He paused, lowering his head into his hands. "But when he followed her out, well, I knew she wasn't just leaving." Greaves' jaw tightened, his hands resting on the table. "Where'd they go, Cullen?" Mark's foot tapped restlessly against the floor, his hesitation lingering like the room's stale air. "They went toward her car, I think. I stayed out back. I didn't want to be involved, but... He exhaled through gritted teeth. A few minutes later I saw Kevin come back, alone, stayed at the bar for a bit, drinking like nothing happened. Torres's pen skated swiftly across her notepad. Greaves, meanwhile, studied Mark with a mix of frustration and reluctant understanding. So, you watched this whole thing and then you what? Just went home like it was no big deal? Mark's voice rose, tinged with desperation. You think I wanted to stay and ask questions? You think I wanted someone like Kevin coming after me? I saw him break a guy's nose just because he looked at him wrong last month. I've got a wife and a kid, Sheriff. Torres's tone turned slightly softer, though she didn't let him off the hook entirely. We get it, Mark, but what we don't get is why you waited so long to come forward. You saw the news. You knew she was dead. I couldn't sleep, Mark blurted out suddenly, fiddling with the zipper on his jacket. Every time I close my eyes I see his face, how pissed he was, and hers. I can't shake it, all right? I had to come in. Maybe it's too damn late, but I had to. Greaves leaned back, crossing his arms as he studied the trembling man. What about after that? Did you notice anything different about Kevin? Did he say anything to you or anyone else? No, Mark replied, shaking his head fervently. He hasn't said a damn word, been laying low, which isn't like him. He's usually running his mouth all over town, but lately, quiet as a church mouse. Because he knows he's in deep, Torres muttered under her breath. Greaves stood, his shadow stretching across the interrogation table. Here's what happens next, Cullen. You're staying close to us for a while. If Kevin catches wind of this, I don't need you turning tail or vanishing into thin air. Mark's eyes widened, but he nodded weakly. All right. As Mark was led out of the room, Greaves exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. Torres spoke up from her seat, flipping her notebook closed. He's afraid of Kevin, sure, but there's more to his fear than we're seeing. He knows Kevin crossed the line this time. Greaves nodded, but didn't respond immediately. His eyes wandered to the caseboard on the far wall, where Kevin Marshall's photograph sat dead center. Beneath it were scattered leads, threadbare evidence, and a growing list of witnesses too afraid to talk. Kevin crossed the line, Greaves said eventually, his voice heavy. But this time, he's not walking away untouched. We're dragging him down if it's the last thing we do. And with that, the sheriff left the room. The pressure of the case was a weight he carried well, but in that moment it felt heavier than ever. An unexpected motive. The break in the case came unexpectedly, but it hit like a thunderclap when it finally did. With Kevin Marshall now under the weight of mounting circumstantial evidence, Greaves and his team worked tirelessly to untangle not just what happened the night of the murder, but why. The latter was far more elusive, clouded in lies, omissions, and misdirections. But the truth? It was always lurking just under the surface. Late one evening at the station, Greaves and Torres were deep in conversation. The dim hum of the police computers filled the silence as Greaves reviewed the overlapping pieces of evidence pinned to the board. Despite their growing case against Kevin, something gnawed at him. What was this whole thing about? Why Loretta? And why now? This can't just be another case of some angry low-life thug who snapped, Greaves muttered, tapping the pushpin where Loretta's photo hung at the center of the board. Her face seemed to almost stare back at him. Marshall's guilty as hell, but no way he just killed her because she said something he didn't like. People like him, they don't shell out murder over nothing. Torres sat across the table, arms crossed. He killed her because she stood up to him. Guys like Marshall hate that, you know it. The second she tried to fight back, he made up his mind. Her voice was confident, full of conviction. Come on, Tom. She wasn't afraid of him like everyone else around here. That's enough of a reason in his book. Greaves shook his head. No, that's too easy, Aaron. If he killed everyone who crossed him, we'd have bodies piling up for miles. He turned, fixing her with a sharp glare. There's something we're not seeing. Across the office, Deputy Caleb Grant peered out from his desk. Couldn't it just be a fight? Maybe they used to have a thing, and when it went bad, well... He left it there, shrugging lightly, though he was clearly eavesdropping. Torres arched a brow and spun her chair toward him. A thing? Like a relationship? Seriously, Caleb. Marshall doesn't care about anyone except himself. No, Caleb said, pushing back his chair and standing up. He slung a hand into his pocket. I mean, look, maybe she had dirt on him. Something big. What if she really could make him pay for something? You ever think of that? For a moment the room fell quiet as Greaves rubbed a hand over his chin in thought. Caleb's point, albeit indirect as always, did spark something. Dirt on him, Greaves repeated. The words hung in the air as pieces of the puzzle started to align in his mind. He glanced toward the stack of files Torres had been working through on Loretta. and gestured for her to bring them over. Let's dig deeper. If she wanted him held accountable, it wasn't for nothing. Torres sighed but complied, grabbing the file from her desk and opening it on the table between them. There's not much to go on. Loretta Johnson, 26. Worked a couple odd jobs here and there, quiet, no criminal record unless you count a parking ticket 2 years back. Grew up in Denver, moved here 6 months ago. Why here? Greaves asked. Cheap rent, probably. Torres shrugged. Honestly, there's nothing here to suggest she had any connection to Marshall, at least not on paper. What about before she moved here? Greaves pressed, leaning over the file. Friends? Family? Torres leafed through the papers. Parents deceased, one sibling, older brother Michael Johnson, said to live in Arizona, or at least he did years ago. No arrests, nothing. And nothing connecting her to Marshall. Greaves leaned back in frustration, rubbing his temples. Damn. That's when the knock came, sharp and unexpected. Come in, Greaves said, looking up toward the door. A young officer entered, a nervous energy clinging to him as he stepped inside holding a file. Sheriff, we have something new. Might clear some things up about Loretta. Both Torres and Greaves snapped their focus to the officer. What is it? Torres asked, gesturing for him to hurry. The officer placed the file on the desk, but his voice broke the big news. We found letters in Loretta's apartment, locked away in a drawer. What kind of letters? Greaves grabbed the file instantly. They seem personal, the officer explained, and I think they might explain why she was connected to Marshall in the first place. Greaves flipped through the papers quickly, scanning the typewritten text. His jaw tightened, the veins in his neck visibly straining as he processed what he was reading. She wasn't just anyone, he muttered, his voice heavy with realization. She was tracking him, investigating him herself. Torres leaned forward, eyeing the letters as they fanned out across the desk. What are you talking about? She knew him, Greaves said, his voice growing angrier with each word. 6 years ago, Denver PD picked up Marshall for an assault case. One of his first major crimes before he got cocky here. The guy he assaulted? Her older brother. He pointed sharply to the letter where his name, Michael Johnson, appeared multiple times. You're kidding, Torres murmured, grabbing the paper and scanning it. Wait, she came here for Marshall? She didn't just come here for him, Greaves said darkly. She wanted justice. Justice that Denver couldn't give her brother, Torres added, piecing it together aloud. He probably got off with a slap on the wrist. Of course he did, Greaves replied, anger simmering just beneath his tone. We should have seen it sooner. She never fully let it go. She did what we couldn't, tracked him down. And somewhere along the way she pushed the wrong button. Torres rubbed her temples. This wasn't just a chance encounter. She confronted him over what he'd done. And he killed her for it, Greaves finished, his voice edged with fury. She was finally brave enough to stand up to him, and he silenced her. Torres set the paper down, breathing deeply to collect herself. We don't just have motive now. This was way more personal than anyone could have thought. Greaves turned, pacing slowly in thought. This changes everything. That letter proves why she was after him, but we're going to need more if we're taking this to court. What's the next move? Torres asked. Greaves stopped pacing. His hand fell to his hip where his holster rested. The determination in his eyes reignited. The next move is simple. We finish what Loretta started. Let's go tear his world apart. And just like that, the room moved into motion, a fire fueling their work like never before. Pressure and confession. The interrogation room was cold, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones and lingered no matter how you shifted in your seat. It wasn't an accident. Sheriff Greaves knew that. He had insisted the room remain just uncomfortable enough. That kind of setting had a way of breaking people down, and right now Kevin Marshall was the one sitting under the flickering fluorescent light. For once, the cocky smirk he always wore, the one that made him untouchable in the eyes of Blackwood's spineless locals, was gone. His jaw was tight, hands cuffed to the steel table, fingers fidgeting nervously. Across from him, Greaves sat with his arms crossed, his eyes hard as stone, while Deputy Torres stood against the wall, watching every move Kevin made like a hawk ready to strike. You've got a fan club outside, Marshall, Greaves started, his voice calm, yet heavy with the weight of authority. Half the deputies in town want to see you rot in a cage, can't blame them really. You've scared this town into silence for years. Kevin scoffed, though it lacked his usual bravado. His voice came out hoarse. I didn't scare nobody. People keep to themselves 'cause it's easier that way. Not my fault they don't want to go looking for trouble. Trouble? Torres cut in, her tone sharp. She pushed off the wall and leaned forward, palms flat on the table as she stared him down. The only trouble in this town is you. You've burned every bridge here, run roughshod over anyone who dared cross you, and now you want to sit there and pretend you're some misunderstood loner? Give me a break." Kevin didn't rise to the bait, just exhaled sharply through his nose, but Greaves could see it, the cracks forming. The bravado was slipping. "You killed her," Greaves said bluntly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "We both know it! The question is, how long are you going to drag this out before you admit it?" Kevin's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "I didn't touch her," he growled, voice low but defensive. Greaves leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs casually as if they were discussing the weather. "I'll give you credit for keeping your story straight. Even your loser crew's been singing that same tired tune. Kevin wasn't there. Kevin doesn't know her. Kevin didn't do nothing. I guess it must be nice to have so many people willing to lie for you." "I don't need anyone lying for me," Kevin shot back, "because I didn't do it." "Right," Torres said with a dry laugh. "The problem with that, Marshal, is that you left a trail so sloppy even my 6-year-old nephew could have solved this case." Kevin's lips twitched, but his silence screamed louder than if he'd spoken. Greaves stood, walking slowly around the table. The heels of his boots echoed with every step. He stopped behind Kevin, looming over him like a shadow. "Let's run through what we've got, shall we? Witnesses saw you fighting with her at the Rusty Nail. We've got a timeline that puts you following her right after she left. Then there's the little matter of her screaming threats about making you pay for what you did. You remember that part?" Kevin shifted in his chair, his shoulders tense. "She was talking nonsense," he muttered. "She didn't know what she was saying." "Oh, but she did," Greaves snapped, circling back to stand in front of him. "She knew exactly what you did, years ago, to her brother. She came here looking for justice, and you couldn't handle it." "No!" Kevin barked, his voice rising for the first time. His knuckles turned white as his hands clenched against the cuffs. "She didn't know the whole story. She thought she did, but she didn't know it all." Torres pounced on the opening like a predator sensing weakness. "But you knew it, didn't you? What she said, what she was planning to do, it scared you." Kevin glared at her but didn't refute the statement. "The only thing you had left," Torres pressed on, "was to shut her up before she could ruin the little kingdom you've built in this dump of a town. That's what happened, isn't it? A scared little man trying to hold on to his scraps of power." Kevin's chair screeched as he shifted, his entire frame tense. "You don't know what the hell you're talking about." Greaves slammed a hand on the table, the sharp crack making Kevin jump. "Then why do you look like someone caught red-handed, huh? You think we're just throwing darts in the dark? We have witnesses. We have evidence. We're inches away from nailing you, Kevin, so spare us this pathetic act." Kevin's face twisted, a mix of anger and desperation. "You don't know what it was like," he snapped, his voice cracking. "She wouldn't stop. Every time I turned around, there she was, digging, asking questions, telling people lies about me. She wanted to ruin me." "And you followed her that night to silence her," Greaves said, his voice quiet but deadly serious. "I didn't mean for it to go that far." Kevin's words exploded from him like they had been trapped for days, weeks even. His breath came in short, shallow bursts as if every word cost him air. "I just wanted to scare her, okay? Make her drop it. She wasn't supposed to fight back like that." Torres exchanged a quick glance with Greaves. They had him now. "What happened next?" Greaves asked, his voice calm again. "Walk us through it, Kevin. All of it." Kevin slumped in his chair, the fight draining out of him. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "I followed her into the woods. I just wanted to talk to her, make her stop, but she got in my face, started calling me a coward, saying she was going to take everything I had. And I just snapped." "What did you do, Kevin?" Greaves pushed, his tone even but unrelenting. "She shoved me, okay?" Kevin's voice cracked, his face pale with the weight of his own words. "And I grabbed her. I didn't mean for it to happen, but my hands were on her neck, and the next thing I knew, she was—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Torres broke it first. "You killed her," she said firmly, no mercy in her tone. "Whether it was what you meant to do or not, you murdered her." Kevin pressed his cuffed hands to his face, muttering to himself under his breath. Greaves leaned over, his voice razor-sharp. "And that was her crime? Standing up to you? Seeking justice for her brother?" Kevin's only response was a quiet, broken, "I didn't know what else to do." "Well, here's the thing, Kevin," Greaves said as he straightened up. "You've got all the time in the world to think about that now, because this is the end of the line for you." Torres moved to open the door, signaling the other deputies to haul Kevin back to the holding cell. As they let a slumped and defeated Kevin Marshall out, Greaves stood silently in the doorway, watching until the man who had terrorized Blackwood for years was finally locked away. Torres let out a long breath, pinching the bridge of her nose. "It's done." For now, Greaves replied. His voice carried the weight of years spent chasing men like Kevin. But this time, as the door to the interrogation room swung shut, he allowed himself a small, hard-earned exhale. There was still work to be done, but justice, for Loretta and for her family, was finally on its way. Uncovering more crimes. The revelation of Kevin Marshall's confession sent ripples through the Blackwood Police Department. In the days following his arrest, the once tight knot of fear Marshall had tied around the town began to loosen. But for Sheriff Greaves, Deputy Torres and their team, the case was far from over. Something about it felt incomplete. "We've got him for Loretta's murder," Greaves said one evening, pacing in his office. The tired leather soles of his boots scuffed the floorboards as he raked a hand through his silvering hair. "But it's too clean, too simple. This guy's never done anything small in his life. Loretta can't be the only thing he's hiding." His voice was firm, laced with the same conviction that had led this investigation from the start. Torres, seated across from him with a thick file open in her lap, nodded. "I was thinking the same thing, Sheriff. A guy like Kevin doesn't just wake up one day and decide to kill someone. Loretta's murder wasn't some random snap. It feels like part of a pattern." Greaves stopped mid-stride and fixed Torres with a look. "What are you thinking?" Torres flipped through her file. "It's something I found when I was cross-checking the old records we dug up. It gave me a bad feeling. There are unsolved missing persons cases dating back almost 6 years, 3 of them, all young women, all connected to this town in some way. And guess who just so happened to buy property here 6 years ago?" "Kevin," Greaves answered immediately, the weight of that single word hitting hard. "Exactly," Torres replied, tapping the papers in front of her. "But here's the thing. None of the disappearances were ever connected to Marshall. There wasn't enough evidence, and the town's so small that they wrote it off as bad luck. A drifter, a runaway. You know how it goes." "They fell through the cracks," Greaves said grimly, leaning on the desk. Torres set her file down and leaned forward. "But now we've got him in custody, Sheriff. If he knows something, if he's involved in any of those disappearances, we're the ones who are finally going to get the truth." It didn't take long to arrange another session with Kevin Marshall. This time, the sheriff wasn't looking for a confession about Loretta. He was after something much bigger. When Kevin was led back into the interrogation room, the shackles around his wrists and ankles clinked loudly against the floor. He looked worn, but still carried that stubborn edge, as if he hadn't fully digested the fact that his time of terrorizing Blackwood was over. Greaves sat across from him, Torres standing at her usual post in the corner. The tension in the room was heavy, thicker even than the first time they'd faced off. Kevin smirked faintly. "Back for more, Sheriff? I already gave you what you wanted. Isn't it time I got my free pass?" Greaves tapped a single sheet of paper on the metal table, just enough to draw Kevin's attention. "You gave us what we wanted about Loretta. But that's just the surface. We're not stupid, Kevin. Loretta's death isn't a standalone incident, is it?" Kevin's smirk faltered ever so briefly, a crack in the armor. "We've been digging, Kevin," Greaves continued, his voice calm but unrelenting. "And you know what we found? 3 names, 3 missing women, all gone within the last 6 years. You've been here the whole time, haven't you?" Kevin's jaw tightened, and for a moment his gaze dropped to the table. He stayed silent. "Come on, Kevin," Torres chimed in, stepping forward. "You've got nothing left to lose. Loretta's gone, and you're not walking out of here. So why not clear your conscience, for once in your miserable life?" Kevin let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Conscience? You're funny, Deputy. You keep acting like you've got it all figured out." "We're close," Greaves said sharply. "Closer than you think. That property you bought out near Ruxton Canyon? We're searching it. Every single square inch of it. You know what we're expecting to find? Clues, bodies, evidence tying you to these women? So why not save us the trouble? Or are you scared of what they'll say about you when this all comes out?" At that, Kevin's fidgeting slowed, and he leaned back in his chair. The flicker of control he'd held onto up until that point was slipping, and it showed in the way his lips pressed together, his hands now gripping the edges of the table. "You don't know what you're digging into, Sheriff," Kevin said finally, his voice low and cold. "Oh, I think we do," Greaves shot back. "You're not some big mysterious figure, Kevin. You thrive on messing with people, intimidating them, breaking them, because if you didn't, what else would you be? Just some sad, angry little man with nothing to his name." Torres crossed her arms, adding her voice to the attack. "Admit it, Kevin. This whole thing, the missing women, Loretta, you didn't do it because you had to. You did it because you liked it." Kevin's eyes darkened, his mouth pulling into a tight line. For a moment he said nothing. Greaves could practically hear the war being waged in the man's mind, pride versus guilt, anger versus control. Finally Kevin spoke. "Fine," he sneered, his voice venomous. "You want the truth? Yeah, I did it, all of it." Torres blinked, her pen halting mid-scribble. "All of it?" Kevin's laugh was hollow, the sound of a man with nothing left to lose. "Loretta found me because she was digging. Those other girls? They got caught in my world. They thought they could escape it, but they couldn't. You don't get to just walk away from me." Greaves leaned forward, his stare icy. "What did you do with them, Kevin?" Kevin was silent for a moment, then his lips curled into a dark grin. "Ruxton Canyon," he said simply. "That's where you'll find them." Greaves restrained his emotions, knowing it wasn't the end just yet. "All three?" Kevin shrugged. "I lost count." Torres's knuckles turned white as her pen gripped tighter. Greaves, however, remained perfectly still, perfectly composed. "Good," the sheriff said finally, his voice measured and calm. "Because now I've got you for more than murder. I've got you for every single ounce of pain you've left in this town." As Kevin was escorted out of the room, a look somewhere between satisfaction and defeat lingering on his face, Torres turned to Greaves. "He gave it up just like that," she said. "Do you think he's telling the truth about Ruxton?" Greaves nodded grimly. "He's not smart enough to lie about this. Get the team ready. We take a crew out there tomorrow morning." There wasn't any celebration in the room, only the heavy realization that what lay ahead near Ruxton Canyon could be worse than anything they had imagined, but for the first time, they were ready to face it. Justice on trial. The courthouse was bustling, its marble-tiled halls echoing with the steady shuffle of footsteps and the low hum of murmured conversations. The trial of Kevin Marshall had turned the sleepy town of Blackwood upside down. Reporters had swarmed the courthouse steps, camera flashes cutting through the crisp morning air. Locals, who rarely ventured into the courthouse unless it was for a traffic ticket, now found themselves seated shoulder to shoulder in the gallery, craning their necks for a view of the notorious man who had terrorized their town for years. Inside courtroom 2C, Sheriff Greaves stood near the back, arms folded tightly across his chest as he watched the proceedings unfold. Next to him, Deputy Torres leaned against the polished wood-paneled wall, her sharp eyes following every movement Kevin Marshall made. He sat at the defense table in a poorly fitted suit, his usual bravado dulled but not completely extinguished. "Does he look nervous to you?" Torres asked quietly, her voice low enough not to disturb the dead-silent room. Greaves didn't take his eyes off Marshall. "Not yet, but he will be." Across the room, Kevin's defense attorney, a smug lawyer from Denver with slick-backed hair and a loud tie, leaned over to whisper something in his client's ear. Kevin shifted in his seat, running a hand over his jaw as his eyes darted toward the rows of spectators behind him. He wouldn't find any friendly faces there. The prosecutor, Jennifer Haynes, was busy arranging her notes at the podium, her black blazer immaculate and her expression set in sharp lines. She turned her gaze toward Greaves and Torres briefly, giving them a slight nod of acknowledgement, a silent promise that she had this under control. "You think the jury's going to buy it?" Torres asked, her voice betraying a hint of doubt. Greaves exhaled slowly, his gaze still locked on Kevin. "They'll buy it. We gave them everything they need, the witnesses, the evidence, his own damn confession. Jennifer's got this just as much as we do. The jury would be fools not to convict him." The judge entered the room through a side door, and everyone rose to their feet as the bailiff called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Wallace Prentice." Judge Prentice was a man in his early 60s with a tired but seasoned expression, his silver-framed glasses perched precariously on the end of his nose. He took his seat at the bench and adjusted his microphone. "You may all be seated," he said, his deep voice reverberating through the room. As everyone settled into their seats, Jennifer Haynes approached the jury box, her confident stride echoing against the hardwood floors. She clasped her hands behind her back, her voice clear and steady as she addressed the 12 men and women whose decision would shape the course of Kevin Marshall's life. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "what we have here is not a complicated case. The evidence, the testimonies, and even Kevin Marshall's own words all point to one undeniable conclusion. This man is a murderer, a predator who has spent years instilling fear in this town. But this trial is not just about Loretta Johnson," she continued, gesturing toward the framed photograph of the victim that rested on a nearby easel. "This trial is about the countless lives Kevin Marshall has destroyed, directly and indirectly, with his reign of terror." Kevin shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands gripping the edges of the defense table. Jennifer didn't miss a beat. Now the defense will try to convince you that Mr. Marshall acted out of fear, that he panicked, that he didn't mean to kill Loretta. But we know better, don't we? People don't strangle others in the heat of the moment and then dump their bodies like garbage in the woods, unless they've been planning, unless they've been capable of such violence for years. And he has. You don't need to take my word for it. You'll hear from witnesses who were too afraid to speak out before. You'll see evidence that paints a chilling picture of a man who believed he was above the law. Greaves leaned slightly toward Torres. She's good. She's a damn lioness, Torres muttered, impressed. As Jennifer retreated to her desk, Kevin's defense attorney stood, adjusting his tie as he approached the jury with a forced smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone deliberately softer, "my client is not the monster the prosecution wants you to believe. Yes, Kevin Marshall made mistakes, but he is not beyond redemption. He is not someone who deserves to spend the rest of his life behind bars for one moment of bad judgment." Torres rolled her eyes. "Bad judgment? That's what we're calling murder now?" Greaves smirked faintly but didn't respond. He knew the defense's strategy was thin, and the jury wasn't buying it. Not with everything they'd seen and heard in the last few days. The trial dragged on as evidence was presented, photographs of the crime scene, recordings of witness testimonies, and even snippets of Kevin's own haunting confession. The jury's expressions grew heavier with every passing moment. By the time the prosecution played the tape of Kevin admitting to Loretta's murder and hinting at other crimes, his voice cold, almost detached, the entire courtroom was silent except for the static hum of the recording. In the gallery, Richard Carter, the man who had found Loretta's body in Hollow Creek Forest, sat with his arms folded tightly across his chest. His normally kind expression was hardened now, his gaze fixed unrelentingly on Kevin. He had become something of a hero in the town, though he didn't feel like one. At one point, Torres leaned over to Greaves again. "You think he's regretting it yet?" Greaves didn't need to ask who she was talking about. He glanced at Kevin for a moment, watching the man who had terrorized Blackwood sit pale-faced, for once unable to intimidate anyone. "Oh, he regrets it," Greaves replied, "just not in the way he should." The closing arguments were a blur of passion and precision. Jennifer's final plea was as sharp and devastating as a dagger to the heart. "Kevin Marshall believed he was untouchable," she said, her voice nearly trembling with conviction. "He believed for years that no one in Blackwood could stand up to him long enough to put him behind bars. He thought the world worked by his rules. Well, today, ladies and gentlemen, you have the rare and powerful opportunity to show him just how wrong he was. Justice, overdue as it may be, comes with your verdict, and I trust it will be the right one." When the jury was finally dismissed to deliberate, the courtroom emptied except for a few stragglers, and the tension was almost unbearable. "How long do you think they'll take?" Torres asked as they waited in the hallway outside. Greaves rubbed the back of his neck. "Doesn't matter. The truth's already written all over their faces." Hours later, when the jury returned, the courtroom was buzzing with electricity. The foreman stood, clearing his throat as he handed the folded piece of paper to Judge Prentice. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor." The room seemed to hold its breath as Judge Prentice unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the verdict before handing it back to the foreman. "In the case of Kevin Marshall, on the charge of first-degree murder, how do you find?" The foreman straightened his posture. "We find the defendant guilty." A wave of relief swept through the gallery, and for the first time in years Blackwood felt lighter. Torres exhaled audibly, leaning back against the wall as the shackles were tightened around Kevin Marshall's wrists. He stood, his head hanging low, as the bailiff began to escort him out of the courtroom. "You were right," Torres said to Greaves. "Justice might have taken a while, but it finally caught up to him." Greaves nodded, though his expression was somber. "One way or another it always does." A costly lesson. The Blackwood police station was unusually quiet for a Friday night. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as Sheriff Greaves sat at his desk, staring out the window into the darkened streets of the small town. A somber cloud hung over the station. Though Kevin Marshall was locked away and justice had been served, the weight of the case still pressed down on everyone. In his bones, Greaves knew they'd done what was right, but the lingering scars wouldn't heal for Blackwood anytime soon. Across from him, Deputy Torres walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner down the street. "I figured you could use one," she said, setting the cup on his desk and slumping into the chair opposite him. Greaves glanced at her and nodded. "Thanks." He rubbed a hand over his face, his exhaustion written in every line and crevice. You'd think getting Marshall finally nailed down would bring some peace, but it doesn't feel like peace, does it? Torres took a sip of her coffee and shook her head. No, it feels incomplete. Like we fought to pull this town back from the edge, but the edge is still there, waiting. Greaves drummed his fingers on his desk. It's more than just that. He leaned forward, folding his hands together. It's what happened to Loretta. She came here to find justice for her brother, because we, law enforcement, the people who are supposed to protect, failed her before. And now she's gone, Torres finished, her voice soft, solemn. Because she had to do what no one else did, what we didn't see coming. Greaves nodded slowly, his expression grim. She should have been a young woman enjoying her life. Instead, she was forced to dig through dirt, stare down a man like Marshall, and pay the price for standing up. Torres leaned back in her chair, her gaze dropping to her coffee cup as she rolled it back and forth between her palms. You think we're a part of that failure, don't you? Silence filled the room for a moment before Greaves finally responded. We carry it, Aaron. Whether it's fair or not, we carry it. Her death, her brother's suffering, everything Marshall inflicted on this town happened because he thought no one would stop him. And the truth is, no one did for years. Torres sighed, resting her elbows on her knees. But he's gone now, locked up for life. That has to mean something, doesn't it? People in this town can breathe again. Sure, Greaves said quietly, staring at the badge on his desk. But the damage is done. Blackwood's not the same place it was 5 years ago, and it's sure as hell not what it was 20 years ago. Torres frowned, lifting her gaze. You're afraid this doesn't end with Marshall. Exactly. Greaves looked her in the eye, his weary face a picture of hardened resolve. If this town's learned anything, it's that monsters don't crawl out of the woods or slither in from the shadows. They're here, they grow here if we let them, and once someone like Marshall gets power, he poisons the whole thing. Torres looked thoughtful, tilting her head slightly. You think we could have done something earlier, or stopped him altogether? Greaves let out a heavy sigh and leaned back in his chair, gripping the armrests as he stared at the ceiling. That's the question, isn't it? Probably not, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't have tried harder. Torres leaned forward again, her voice soft but firm. So what do we do now, Tom? Because going back to the way things were isn't going to cut it. Greaves stared at her for a long moment before he spoke. We don't sit on our hands, that's for damn sure. We don't let the small stuff slide anymore. No more assuming things are just bad luck, or people are just runaways. If something doesn't feel right, we dig until there's nothing left to find. Doesn't sound like the kind of job people sign up for when they think of small-town law enforcement, Torres said with a dry chuckle. No, Greaves agreed, a faint smile ghosting his tired face, but it's the job we've got now. They sat in silence for a moment, both letting the weight of the past few months settle over them. Eventually Torres broke the quiet. Loretta, Richard Carter, even that coward Mark Cullen, they all taught us something, Tom. People stand up in their own ways when it matters most. We didn't stand as early as we should have, but at least we're here now. Greaves nodded. That's the thing about justice, Aaron. Sometimes it's late, sometimes it's messy, but it needs people willing to fight for it, and by God, we better be those people from now on. Torres smiled faintly and raised her coffee cup in a small toast. Here's to that. Better late than never, but never late again. Greaves raised his own cup silently in agreement, the unspoken promise between them loud and clear. The lesson wasn't just for the law enforcement officers of Blackwood, it was for the town itself. Monsters like Kevin Marshall thrived in silence, in fear, and in apathy. Loretta Johnson had paid the ultimate price to break that silence, and in her sacrifice, she had awakened something stronger. As Torres stood to leave, she glanced back at Greaves, still seated at his desk. You know, she said, if we can make sure this never happens again, maybe Loretta's story won't just be another tragedy. Maybe it'll be the reason this town gets back to being the kind of place where people don't have to keep looking over their shoulder. Greaves gave her an approving nod. That's the vision, Aaron. Now let's make it real. And with that, she left him there, staring out the window again, his coffee untouched, but his mind sharper than it had been in weeks. Greaves knew it wouldn't be easy, but then, things worth fighting for never were.